You talked about how back in the day the owners just tried to take that cheap route, but these days these guys are getting paid a crazy amount of money out here in the MLB. What comparatively the salaries then to now? What were they like? Like, what was considered a top paid guy by the Yankees or another organization in baseball at that time compared to what it is now? Like,
Well, when the Yankees first started and the American League and National League would bid against themselves for players and try to steal each other's players, the Yankees made an astronomical offer to in order to get Wee Willie Keeler. The astronomical offer was $10,000 a year
wow,
for 3 years, and that was far more than anybody else was making at the time. 3 or 4,000 per year was a pretty typical salary. The Yankees tried to get Honus Wagner when they first started, and Clark Griffith, who was the first manager / GM, showed up at his house on a snowy night and put $21,000 bills on his kitchen table to try to get him. And he turned it down because he was that loyal to Pittsburgh. He was from there. But to answer your question, $4,000 or $5,000 per year would be a typical salary.
wow.
One year, and if you didn't have a good year, you were going to get cut the next year. So that's and that system really lasted,
Wow.
really until the 1970s.
So basically, what you're telling me is a guy like Bryce Harper or Giancarlo Stanton could have funded the entire league with their salary now.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Without question, yeah.
Yeah,
Now
yeah.
keep in mind that's $10,000 went a long way then.
Yeah.
It would probably be the equivalent of about 300,000 or 400,000 today.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean,
That's what I said.
yeah.
So they did. So by the standards of the day, they did very well.
Right.
But many of them, and of course, this is why players held out for more money every year. Often missed. Joe, if you ever look, I remember when I was covering the Yankees, and they put out an opening day fact sheet every year, and Bernie Williams had become the Yankee who started the most opening days in center field. And I said, well, how could that be? He's only been here 8-9 years. How could he have the most opening day starts in center field? Well, it's because Joe DiMaggio was holding out every year.
Wow.
And he only started on opening day 3 or 4 times because he was making maybe 15 or 20,000 in the 30s, and he was holding out, for more.
Joe D started the holdout.
Yeah, no. So players were always holding out, and they were also looking to make more money. The Yankees' best player in the early days, Hal Chase, who was remembered and known for shady doings, he would every so often, especially if they were out of the race, which they usually were then, he would skip a game, go to New Jersey, and play a semi-pro game for like side money, and of course he's still playing. So they would do all kinds of things to try to make some extra money on the side and monetize their pay. But they were doing better than the average person was at any point. But compared to today, of course, it's just it's a shadow of the salaries that they get today.
Hey, Dom, reading your book, Dom, I found probably, I won't say the most interesting, but one of the things I never knew. And that was the new face of the Yankees before Babe Ruth. Now, this guy went on to become the founding father of football, was one of the greatest football coaches in the history of the football itself. So can you tell us about that guy just before Babe Ruth that couldn't hit a curveball?
Yeah, George Halas was his name, of course, more famous in football. George Halas, it's a kind of a staple of trivia question. Who was the Yankees' right fielder before Babe Ruth? And the answer being George Halas. That's not technically true. Halas was actually had gone to the minor leagues in 1919, and Babe Ruth actually started at other positions. So it wasn't like one didn't succeed the other. But with George Halas, obviously the Yankee scouts went out looking for talent, and most of the players then. Would go from high school. They would sign with their local minor league team in the low minors, and they would be sold up the ladder until a major league team saw them and then would sign them. But the Yankees had heard about this guy playing at the University of Illinois, and obviously he was more famous for football, but he was a really good baseball player, and he tore up the Big Ten or whatever they might have called the league then. That I don't know off the top of my head, but they signed him for a few $1,000s, and of course there was no pro football, so even though he was a much better football player, he signed with the Yankees. Well, he finishes up his career in the Rose Bowl in 1919. He plays in the Rose Bowl. That year, the Rose Bowl was a military game coming out of World War I. It was like a Navy All-Stars and Army All-Stars. and he'd been playing for a naval base. And he was the MVP of the Rose Bowl. He intercepted a pass and returned it for a touchdown, and caught a pass on offense for a touchdown. So he was the MVP. Oh. So when he shows up for training camp, maybe 6-7 weeks later, he's in football condition. And most of the players in those days that worked odd jobs in the off season and didn't believe in weight training or anything like that, most players were out of shape. They came to training camp to get in shape. That was what spring training was really for. It's not like today. So here all these guys are kind of overweight and out of shape and slow and sluggish. This guy comes in college football shape. He's the MVP of the Rose Bowl. And he's a five-tool player. He hit for power, which in those days meant a lot of doubles and triples, but he could hit the ball over everybody's head in the outfield. He could run faster, probably the fastest guy on the team, had a shotgun of an arm, and it looked like he was a pretty good hitter. So he starts playing, and he's a switch hitter, which was very, very rare at that time. So much like the stories that you've probably read of spring training 1951, when Mickey Mantle kind of showed up, right. George Halas shows up in Jacksonville in spring training in 1919, and he just electrifies camp. The writers are talking about him, and they're writing about him every day. And Miller Huggins, who very rarely praised players anyway, especially young players, said, "Unless I'm wrong, this kid's a major league ball player, and he's going to be our right fielder." So by the end of camp, it looks like George Halas is going to be that big thing that the Yankees have been looking for a long, long time. Wow. That he was going to be their franchise star, and a young star who never played anywhere else. Because then, as later on, they were trying to quick fix it by buying players who were past their prime. But now they had a guy that was a young guy and had never played anywhere else. So it was starting to create this big sensation. Well, he hits a ball over everyone's head in Jacksonville and legs out a triple and hurts himself. He hurts his hip. So he couldn't. Now he had to sit out, and he wasn't really ready to play, and he couldn't run. And he ended up going to this doctor who specialized in hips, as they didn't have the kind of technology they do now. And the guy just was less a chiropractor. He snapped the hip back in place. Oof. And then Halas was okay. So he rejoins the Yankees in May, and now he's okay in terms of his speed, but now he's kind of exposed that he can't hit a curveball. So he got a couple of hits, and he stole a few bases, but he just could not hit a curveball. And so at one point, when they went to Detroit, the Yankees said, "Well, look, he's on the bench," and the Yankees said, "Well, look, you want to make yourself useful, drive Ty Cobb out of his mind. Just go call him every name in the book, get him out of his game, distract him." So George Halas is in the dugout screaming everything you could imagine at Ty Cobb when he comes to bat. And then Ty Cobb, he was starting to look at the dugout. Ty Cobb wanted to go crack his head open with his bat. So they agreed to meet outside after the game. And by the time they did, Ty Cobb had cooled off, and he said, "Listen, son, that's no way to act. That's no way to handle yourself on the field." And they had a long talk, and they became friends. And when the Tigers came to New York later that year, they actually met at the hotel in Manhattan, and they walked all the way uptown to the Polo Grounds, and talked things over. So they were actually friends, and Cobb tried to take him under his wing. But ultimately, the Yankees thought that Halas had tremendous potential, but he needed to spend some time in the minor leagues and to try to learn how to hit the curveball. And Halas came to the conclusion at this point that if he's going to go back to the minor leagues, because again, this is one of the most accomplished athletes in the United States. Let's try this football thing. A few players had gotten together. Let's try to launch a football league and play pro football. And that was ultimately he quit baseball, concentrated on football, and that's the rest was history. I think history shows he made the right decision. But you never know. You never know what a guy with tremendous power as a switch hitter who could run like he could run and was a first class athlete, what he might have done in Yankee Stadium when it was built a couple of years later. He might have been Mickey Mantle before Mickey Mantle, but he ultimately chose football and was probably. But yeah, very very much. You think when you read about his brief time with in baseball, it's almost a little bit like Bo Jackson in that he had this tremendous speed and power that was unheard of in baseball, particularly at that time.
Oh, that's very, very, very cool. I tell you, that's one of my favorite parts of the book.